This video is going to serve as a very brief overview of prokaryotic cells, and then we are going to talk about the plasma membrane and a brief overview of the types of transport, because the one role of the plasma membrane is to regulate molecules entering and exiting the cell through the plasma membrane. So in this picture, you see a prokaryotic cell, a bacteria. And this bacteria contains some accessory structures. An accessory structure is a structure that not all bacteria have. Okay, so all bacteria have a plasma membrane, DNA, things like that, but not all of them have a flagella. Okay, so as we go through these content videos and cover this material, I will be indicating if something is an accessory structure or not. So as you can see, this bacteria is relatively simple, and I think you'll be able to appreciate how simple it is once we get to the more complex type of cells. But for now, I want you to notice that there really is no internal compartmentalization in this bacterial cell. Okay, everything on the inside is just kind of hanging out together. All right, so it lacks organelles or tiny organs. Okay, and so everything inside the cell is in the same space, all hanging out together. Okay, and you'll also notice that it does not have a nucleus. A lot of people think that because the DNA of a bacterium is all clustered in one region, that it counts as a nucleus, and it does not. We refer to this as the nucleoid. A nucleus is where there's actually a nuclear wall, or nuclear envelope is what it's called, which is like walls that protect the contents of the nucleus. And there are no walls or compartmentalization inside of a prokaryotic cell. So we say there is a nucleoid, but not a nucleus. Okay, so when we talk about the structures associated with a prokaryote, we are going to kind of start with the plasma membrane, which is like the wall of the cell, and then we are going to work our way outwards, and then we'll talk about all these things inside of the cell. So all cells have a plasma membrane. Okay, this is like the border of the cell or the wall of the cell. And the plasma membrane is a phospholipid bilayer. Okay, so during your prerequisite courses, you should have learned about phospholipids. And so remember, a phospholipid looks kind of like this, okay? It's got this head group here, this circle, and it has two fatty acid tails. And remember, the reason phospholipids are important is because they are amphipathic. Try and spell this out with my mouse, and it's really hard. Amphipathic. That means part of the molecule is hydrophobic or water-fearing, and the other part is hydrophilic or water-loving. So this charged head group right here is hydrophilic. It loves water. And these two fatty acid tails are hydrophobic. Okay, they do not like water. So because writing with this mouse is hard, I'm just gonna put a frown face. Hydrophobic. The tails are hydrophobic. And so if you'll look down here at this picture, you'll notice the two layers of phospholipids. Notice that how they're arranged, so I'm gonna draw it a little bit bigger. So there's one phospholipid, and then the second layer is arranged like this so that their tails are touching. This creates right here a hydrophobic barrier. Okay, I want you to think about water and what you know about water, right? Water is the universal solvent. Most things are gladly dissolved by water, right? Things love water. Well, molecules that love water, that are hydrophilic, are incompatible with hydrophobic environments. Okay, so the reason these two layers of phospholipids are arranged this way is it creates, I'm going to mark it on the picture here, it creates this really big barrier that is hydrophobic, which prevents hydrophilic molecules from just crossing this membrane all willy-nilly, okay? Because hydrophilic molecules are incompatible with a hydrophobic environment, molecules can't just cross whenever they want. Okay, that'd be bad for the cell. It has to be strictly regulated. So by having this hydrophobic barrier, the cell is able to regulate what goes into the cell and what goes out of the cell. Okay, it can regulate how many things go into or out of the cell. It regulates when things go in and out of the cell. Okay, so this hydrophobic barrier is really important. But these hydrophilic head groups are also important because what is inside of a cell? Water. What is outside of a cell? Water. Okay, so doesn't it make sense that if this membrane is surrounded by water, the whole thing cannot be hydrophobic, right? Hydrophobic means doesn't like water. So the parts of the phospholipid, these little head groups that love water, are on the outside facing the water and also on the inside of the cell facing the water. Those hydrophobic tails, that hydrophobic environment is sandwiched in between, okay, and serves as a barrier between what's outside of the cell and what's inside of the cell. So again, just because I get a little nervous that I've said the wrong hydro word, I want to reiterate right now, just make sure it's crystal clear. These head groups right here that I'm drawing the lines from, these are hydrophilic. They love water. These tails are hydrophobic. They do not like water. So they prevent most molecules from being able to cross the membrane. Okay, so aside from phospholipids, what else are in a membrane? Well, lots of proteins, okay? So let me erase all of this writing real quick, because I don't think I can change colors when I'm in presentation mode. Maybe I'm wrong, I'm not sure. Okay, so I'm gonna circle some of the proteins. So this guy down here is a protein. And then there's lots of them. This guy is a protein. This purple guy is a protein. This guy's a protein. Okay, there's lots of them. All of these are proteins. But notice that they're associated with the membrane a little bit differently, right? So I'm gonna talk about them one at a time. So some proteins that are completely outside of the membrane, they're kind of attached like on one end. These are called peripheral proteins because they're on the periphery of the cell, okay? And some proteins, kind of like this guy right here and this guy right here. Do you see how part of them are inserted into the membrane, right? This region right down here, and then all this region up here is inserted in there. Those are called integral proteins because part of them are integrated within the membrane. Okay, and depending on what side of the membrane they're on, like sometimes they have these carbohydrates attached to them, and they're kind of involved in like cell-to-cell recognition and cell signaling. So they increase like communication between cells. The other type of integral protein, a special type of integral protein, let me erase this, are transmembrane proteins. And that's what this guy is right there. I'm pointing to that purple thing. That is a transmembrane protein. So notice it completely spans the membrane, right? Part of it is inside the cell, part of it is outside of the cell, and it's hollow. This allows molecules to either exit the cell or enter the cell. And they normally only work one way, but that's not always true. Sometimes some of these proteins can actually let things out of the cell and let things in. Okay, so it all just depends on the protein. So this is a special type of integral protein, and it is called a transmembrane protein. Okay, and so again, this is normally used for transporting molecules across the membrane. All right, so let's talk about transport. For this slide, it's going to be big picture, really defining terms. I'm going to have separate videos that talk about passive transport in detail and active transport in detail. So the purpose of membrane transport is to let things out of the cell or bring things into the cell. And passive transport and active transport are essentially opposites of one another. You don't need any input for passive transport occurs. It's a passive process. It just happens naturally. But opposite of that is active transport, where ATP or energy is required for the transport process to occur. Okay, and this is because of the direction molecules are moving. So here's how I think about it. I'm not a big fan of crowds. Okay, so if I'm in a crowded space, I will gladly, willingly, without a fight, go to where there's nobody. Okay, and that is an example of passive transport. Molecules move from high amounts, high concentrations, to where there's low concentrations. Okay, so remember, in science, concentration means amount. So with passive transport, molecules move down a concentration gradient. That means they move from where there's a lot of molecules to where there's not a lot of molecules. Okay, so that is called going down a concentration gradient. You definitely want to jot that down. Okay, make sure you know what it means when I say molecules move down their concentration gradient. They're going from lots to a little. And because they're going from high amounts to low amounts, it's a passive process. They don't need any energy. This just happens naturally. Okay. On the other hand, with active transport, molecules are moving against their concentration gradient. So they're going from low amounts of molecules to high amounts. So essentially, they're going into the crowd. Okay, they're going to fight their way to the front of a concert stage, right? If you want to do that, you're going to have to throw some elbows in order to get to the front, right? Because that's where everybody wants to be. So you have to put in energy in order to go against a concentration gradient. So with passive transport, the next video is going to talk about the different types of passive transport, and that is simple diffusion, also just called diffusion. There's facilitated diffusion and osmosis, which is the diffusion of water. With active transport, we're only going to talk about the general process of active transport. So there's no like specific types that we're going to talk about. Okay. All right, that is the end of this video. Please let me know if you have any questions.